Today, Starbucks is almost synonymous with the word coffee. The company is worth an absolutely incredible $113 billion, and there are more than 32,000 Starbucks locations in 80 countries. There is almost no one who hasn't had a Starbucks coffee, and even fewer who haven't heard of it. But most people have no idea who invented this iconic brand and created the empire we know today. Long before Starbucks became the worldwide sensation it is today, the dream of opening a store that sold dark roasted coffee beans came to a young writer in Seattle. Gordon Bowker traveled to Rome, Italy, on a European vacation, and for the first time in his life, tried a truly incredible cup of coffee. At the time, Americans were drinking mostly instant or subpar diner coffee, and Gordon became obsessed with the real thing. He used to drive across the border to Canada to buy his coffee when he returned to North America. And it was during one of these trips that he had the idea that he would open a shop where he was living in Seattle. He contacted two of his former classmates, Gerald Baldwin and Zev Siegel, with the idea, and they were equally excited about the store. However, they didn't quite know enough about the industry to get started. So they contacted Alfred Peet, who already had a coffee shop at which he roasted and sold coffee beans from Europe. They named their store Starbucks after one of the characters in their favorite novels, Moby Dick. And in 1971, the store officially opened in Pike Place Market, selling coffee beans, teas, and spices along with coffee makers. While there would be no Starbucks without these three men, they are not who made the business what we know it to be today. That was Howard Schultz. While the guys were opening their store in Seattle, Howard Schultz was graduating from high school in Brooklyn and about to attend Northern Michigan University to earn his degree in communications. The young student grew up in a poor family with parents Fred and Elaine Schultz and two siblings in Brooklyn, New York. Howard was the first in his family to attend college, but as he didn't have any savings when he lost his football scholarship due to injury, he started working odd jobs around campus to pay for his education. This time in his life was challenging, but it certainly taught him the work ethic he would eventually need to succeed in the corporate world. When Howard graduated, he got a job with Xerox, but quickly moved on to work for Hammerplast. It was while working for this company that his life changed forever. He realized that there was one company which was purchasing most of their coffee makers, Starbucks in Seattle. Young Howard was curious about this small coffee shop that was selling so many machines, so he went to Seattle to check it out. While there, he tried one of their daily samples of the dark roasted coffee and fell in love. Howard was doing incredibly well at his company and making plenty of money, but he truly believed that Starbucks had something special and was willing to give it all up to work there. However, the three founders didn't think that taking on a corporate New Yorker was the right choice for their business and continually denied his request for a job within the business. Finally, they gave in and offered Howard a job in 1982. Only 1 year later, Howard was sent to Milan on business and noticed something that would not only change his life, but also those of every coffee-drinking American. In Italy, Howard was enthralled by the ever-present espresso machines. The coffee that they produced was like none he had ever had, and he realized that Starbucks was really missing the mark by only selling beans, not actual cups of coffee. When he returned to the U.S., he decided he wanted to show Americans how to truly enjoy a great cup of coffee through selling espressos, cafe lattes, cappuccinos, and many other beverages that the general public had simply never heard of. But as with every great idea, he experienced quite a bit of resistance. The founders believed that Starbucks was a retailer, not a restaurant, and that Howard's idea of selling coffee would not only change their entire business, but likely ruin it. Instead, they decided to use their money to increase their existing business by buying out Adolfo Peet's coffee roasting business in 1984. But unfortunately, the merger left Starbucks in debt, and the owners felt trying a new business model at that time would be the end of the road. By 1985, Starbucks had 6 locations around Seattle, but they were still struggling. Howard felt strongly about his idea to serve coffee and felt extremely frustrated by the founders' refusal to implement it. Finally, Howard decided that he was going to make his dream happen, even if he had to do it on his own. In 1985, Howard met Scott Greenberg, a lawyer who was just as on board with his coffee shop idea as he was, and he decided that with investors behind him, he would finally make his dream come true. Surprisingly, one of his investors was Starbucks itself. They offered Howard $150,000 to be a part of Il Giornale. However, that wouldn't be enough to get started, and Howard flew to Italy in the hopes of receiving a large investment from an Italian espresso machine company. But the Italians didn't invest as they did not believe Americans had the right culture to enjoy a proper cup of coffee as they did. Despite this speed bump, it didn't deter Howard. He kept at it and got the investments he needed to open. In 1986, he opened his first shop and called the company Il Giornale, after a proper Italian newspaper. Though he had the money he needed, the investors were unsure that this idea would ever make their money back. They were afraid that people wouldn't even be able to pronounce the name, let alone pay extra for a tiny espresso that, as opposed to a large cup of coffee, for half the price. And when they opened, things got even worse. Howard's idea to create an authentic Italian coffee bar did not function well within American culture. There was nowhere to sit, the baristas wore ties, and opera was playing all day long. In order to adjust their business model to the residents of Seattle, they changed the music, offered to-go coffee, and even brought in seats for those who did wish to sit and drink their coffee. Sales were acceptable, but not impressive, and the company was losing more money than it was making. Jack Benaroya, Herman Sarkowski, and Sam Strom were 3 of the biggest names in Seattle's corporate world. And although they had many demands, after a meeting with Howard, they decided to invest $750,000 in his business. This investment was big, and while it could have changed a great deal for Il Giornale, it wasn't enough for what Howard wanted to do next. At the time, the founders of Starbucks decided they wanted to sell the business, and Howard wanted to buy it. However, Starbucks had become so successful that it was now worth more than $3 million, money which Howard didn't have. While he was trying to get more from his existing investors in order to make the purchase, one of his investors decided that he wanted to buy the company on his own instead. True to his ambition and dedication to his dream, Howard pushed through and convinced his investors that his plan would make them the most money possible. And although it seemed futile and devastatingly frustrating to come up with $3.5 million, he actually did it. So in 1987, the Starbucks we know today was born. Now, Howard was focused on expanding, and he opened almost 100 locations around the United States. This marketing tactic was seen as risky from the investors. Not only was Howard spending quite a deal of money to open the stores, but there also was a strain on the company's relationship with independent coffee chains to whom they once sold their beans. But many see this time of expansion as the great coffee education of Americans. For the first time, people all around the country were trying their very first espresso or latte, and actually understanding what a true Italian-style coffee should taste like. Howard stayed on as CEO until 2000. When he decided to step down in order to focus on international expansion. Over the next 10 years, Starbucks did open its doors in several countries around the world, but at home, the company was struggling. In 2008, Howard took back his seat as CEO and had quite a lot of work to do. The Starbucks image was being dragged through the mud as they faced a $100 million lawsuit from one of their former baristas in California. But Howard Schultz is an extremely talented businessman, and he continued to fight to keep Starbucks not only financially successful, but growing into one of the biggest companies on the planet. By 2016, Schultz stepped down as CEO again to focus on other projects, But by then, Starbucks had already opened over 28,000 stores in 77 countries. The board, investors, and public shareholders were doing extremely well, and Howard Schultz himself was now worth millions of dollars. And while it was certainly safe to say that exactly 30 years after Schultz bought Starbucks, it was a wild success, things have progressed even further in the past 8 years. Howard spent a great deal of his energy ensuring the market for Starbucks was top-notch. He focused on providing fair trade coffees and keeping his offerings consistent with the needs of his target customer, but also ensuring he stayed true to what Starbucks was always meant to be: dark roast European coffee with the best flavor around. Now, Howard is the 209th richest person in the world, with a net worth of over $4.3 billion, and his influence in the financial and even political culture of the United States is almost unbelievable. In fact, he almost ran for president of the country. Next time you drink a Starbucks coffee, you will undoubtedly remember the story of Howard Schultz and how he created this empire from the retail store that the three young Seattle academics created all those years ago. And as Howard has said, remember the power that savoring a simple cup of coffee can have to connect people and create community. Hungry for another fascinating business story? Click on the following video to hear the crazy story about the poor orphan who invented Jack Daniels.